David, if you would come and help us understand just what is going on.
Thank you very much. It's good to meet you. Thank you very much for inviting me here. Thank you very much for receiving me. I thought you'd all have had enough of Brits by now. I certainly have. To admit that I'm not an expert in your field, and you've been hearing from those already, you'll hear from more of those later, and very impressive they are as well. And my biggest feeling at the moment I landed in Luxembourg and then coming into this room is just how calm it all is. The taxi drivers never seem to be able to take you to the right place, but it's incredibly calm and nobody kind of gets bothered about it. And the business here being transacted seems incredibly calm as well. So my kind of text really for today is, given everything that I've been thinking about, writing about, and other people have for the last few years, is which is actually primary? Which will rule? Economics or politics? Which is the great force that will shape your situation over the course of the next 5 to 10 years? Is it going to be economic forces or is it going to be political forces? Now, not so very long ago, there wouldn't really have been much doubt about what the answer would be. Bill Clinton famously coined the expression, it's the economics stupid. It's the economy stupid, actually, was his exact phrase. And that was an absolute truism right at the time that he said it. In other words, you go down to the economic fundamentals and you will find out what's going to happen in the world of politics. It's like a kind of old-fashioned Marxism in which the economic base determines what happens in the ideological superstructure. As an infant communist myself, I was brought up in a communist family, we believed that to be completely true, and every time it turned out not to be true, it was kind of confounding. But it's not just Marxists who have to find out whether or not this is, and get a shock finding out whether this is a problem, it's everybody else. Now, Clinton, of course, was just following somebody like the presidential candidate of the 30s and 40s, Calvin Coolidge, who said, after all, the chief business of the American people is business. Adam Smith's homo economicus. What will happen in the end is that voters and others will take decisions based on a rational assessment of their own, by and large, material interests. That's what we expect to happen. That, if you like, is the deep underlying model that we anticipate. Of course, there will be arguments about resource allocation, but those will happen between certain limits. Not only that, but when we live in a world in which wealth increases, we imagine that that wealth means a reconciliation of interests. Not everybody gets exactly everything that they want, but in the English phrase, a rising tide floats all boats. If the economy is going up, everybody's going to be a bit happy. Some people, of course, much happier than others. A few of those boats get extremely large with ballrooms and gold-plated lavatories and so on. And we can see, as we see from the story about the Nissan chief executive today, sometimes one wants to hide some of that gold plate so that people can't see it, and then you get caught out. But nevertheless, by and large, that's the model. So before 2008, no one really complained. Now, it seems to me to be an effort to recall those kind of certitudes of firstly, the post-fall of the Berlin Wall world. Poor old Francis Fukuyama has got it in the neck over and over again for saying that it was the end of history. He didn't quite mean it in the way his critics have suggested, but nevertheless we understood by and large what it meant, and what it meant was the things that I've been talking about, which is the triumph of the model of liberal democracy, which, as other countries became more economically active and powerful, would gradually be the system that operated there too, because it underwrites everything. Even after 9/11, the big shock of 9/11, we were still confident, I think, that that was the order of things that prevailed. The essential order of things was undisturbed. The democratic West was paramount, not unchallenged completely, not without problems, but paramount. The The globalised economy enriched parts of the world, China, India, Brazil, some of which had been incredibly poverty-stricken and indeed famine-stricken countries when I was a boy. We used to read regularly about famines in the Indian state of Bihar, and of course there were famines in China that we weren't told about, the great disasters of the Great Leap Forward and so on under Mao. And Africa, and the whole continent of Africa was seen as being essentially a basket case that would never able to manage to get out from underneath its troubles. But under globalization, a rules-based international system which most abided by has led to significant increases in people's wealth. And most of us now have tended to believe in the power of the trade deal and the handshake. Things don't have to be done by other mechanisms. We have the rules in place and we have the economic systems in place that will allow things to happen. And that idea even survived the crash of 2008. It was a terrifying short period. The governments of the world, by and large, did what was necessary, picked up and shook the financial institutions, which also shook themselves. We dusted it all down and we got on with the business of business. But since 2011, I think that we have faced an absolutely extraordinary set of challenges, and the notions of that unchallengeable system has faced a series of enormous challenges. And I am far from confident, and that's the part of this is why I've made the speech in the way I have, that we are going to survive it intact. And therefore, when we talk about your business environment, what I think I'm saying is, it actually is much more under assault, possibly, than people in a calm playroom like this, in a calm place like this, might believe. Now, I don't mean by this I'm trying to scare you witless, except to say that I'm pretty scared when I look around, and here's why. Since 2011, a country on the fringes of the Mediterranean, Syria, has displaced half of its population, one half of its population, some internally, a significant amount externally. There is nearly no post-war precedent. In fact, there is no post-war precedent on the verges of Europe for such a displacement. In 2014, Russia annexed part of a neighbouring country, the first such annexation in post-war Europe, and then embarked upon a strategy of disruption of European and of American politics. It has become increasingly clear since 2008 that the Chinese government does not see the benefits of a political liberalisation, or that it necessarily follows that an economic liberalisation, economic success, has to lead to such a liberalisation. Indeed, under Xi, it's actually gone into political reverse. It now operates a tighter system, and not only that, its tighter system of censorship and so on is a model which it is effectively spreading to other countries as a desirable model, rather than being forced back into itself. The Refugee Crisis of 2015, which was led in the first instance by the Syrian overspill from the millions of refugees that accumulated in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, without the United States feeling under President Obama that it was actually able to do anything about it, melded with the much smaller but nevertheless very distressing problem of the Mediterranean boat migrants, which already existed. Now that created an enormous impression amongst the populations of Europe and elsewhere of a situation which was literally out of control. The visions of large numbers of Syrian refugees and others crowding at the borders of Central Europe, with only Angela Merkel actually having the faintest idea what to do about it, and to sense it's the Swedish government, was something that was incredible, was almost indelibly marked upon the psyches, the political psyches of people in Europe, I contend. Now, combined, these features have led to what the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci used to call morbid symptoms. In other words, a kind of politics has started to grow up which we have not seen for a very, very long time, and in a combination we haven't seen for a very long time. Part of this is an astonishing lack of political confidence in liberal democracy. It's one thing, as we talked about, to have Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, Jair Bolsonaro now in Brazil. We already had, of course, Maduro in Venezuela. That's bad, but in a sense, we've kind of been there in Latin America and in some of the Pacific countries. It's awful for them, but we can kind of, we can cope with it. It's a completely different thing to watch possible westernizers turn into authoritarians. And I'm thinking particularly of President Erdogan in Turkey, and I retrain worries, frankly, myself, about Narendra Modi in India if things don't go as well as he wants them to go. And even where there have been hopes of liberalisation in very important partners of the West, think now of Saudi Arabia and what's been going on with regard to Saudi Arabia in the last few weeks. What happened to Jamal Khashoggi is an almost entirely unprecedented event during the course of my adult life. The Russians occasionally used to do it. You remember Georgy Markov, the Bulgarian who was killed on Westminster Bridge and so on. It was a facet sometimes of Cold War politics. But the killing of one of your own critics in an embassy diplomatic property in a third country is an absolutely astonishing act. The very idea that anybody thought it was possible to get away with it tells you something. I mean, it's been called a botched assassination. I'm not quite sure how it was supposed to have been done better. So my inclination is to think that actually somehow or other the Saudis believed, or the Saudi Crown Prince believed, that this was something that was survivable. And you know what? It may yet be survivable. It may yet be that the critics of the Saudi Arabian government don't feel that they're in a position, really, once they've got the apologies and so on, and maybe a rap over the knuckles, to do anything very much about it. The consequences of that is that other countries with their own Jamal Khashoggis should feel, if they have a relative amount of power, relative that there is a degree of impunity that they have to act in the same way. Now again, you might feel that, that's unfortunate, but doesn't necessarily have a lot to do with you. So now I come to the next point of what I'm saying is, which is we now have an altogether different phenomenon added to these malign phenomena, which is essentially the death, or at least the decline, of homo economicus and the rebirth of homo ideologicus. The human being who is not motivated primarily by a rational sense of their own well-being, but by the excitement or the resentment or the anger of an idea. And this is very difficult for people like us. It's difficult enough for people like me. For people like you, I should imagine it's very difficult too. So, in my own incredibly rational, phlegmatic country of Britain, here's a story from Bloomberg this afternoon. I'll just read a little bit of it for you. Syed Joinu was in for a rude shock on a September morning when he walked into Indos, the curry house he owns just outside London. It was already 10:30 a.m. and not a single employee had turned up. Distraught, he called 4 of his Romanian staff. Nobody responded. 2 others, who also quit their jobs the same day without any notice, later told him the Romanians had already left the country for good. And soon thereafter, Joinu, 62, it's very important for journalists that we tell you what everybody's age is, was forced to shut down the business that earned more than £400,000, $500,000 a year. Now, the irony in this is that Mr. Joinu had voted to leave the European Union. He'd been told that as a consequence of getting rid of freedom of movement for Europeans, what people who our Prime Minister today described as jumping the queue, that they would easily be replaced by a new immigration system which allowed him to recruit more Indian staff, and he voted for Brexit on that basis. What he didn't quite realise was that there was going to be an interregnum of half a decade between those two events, and in that interregnum his business failed. Brexit has already got rid of one of our Prime Ministers in Britain, and it could possibly soon bring down a second Prime Minister. The Conservative Party internally were some of them were busily seeing to see if they could kind of get a revolt against Theresa May so that they could change the nature of the negotiation from Britain's side on the basis that somehow or other we would go back to the European Union and say, well, we know we agreed this with you and so on, but that was then and this is now, and can we come back to it again? And what do you mean we can't? Now, this original decision, the Brexit decision, I can assure you, and whatever the rhetoric, and despite Mr. Joinu's belief, it was done in the knowledge by many voters that the country might suffer for it economically. People knew that, quite possibly in the medium term and conceivably in the long term. After the referendum, I went up to one of the towns that had voted to leave, a town called Wakefield in Yorkshire, and talked to quite a lot of people who'd voted for leave. And almost all of them said, when you tax them with the thought that they might suffer economically, they would say things like this. One, we've been through worse. It's a very, very, very big thing. We've been through worse. You know, like the Second World War and stuff like that. We've been through worse. We can get over this. And at least they would say, we are ourselves again. And we don't have to rely on anyone else. This is a very, very, very big theme. But if we do suffer economically, it will be worth it. That is a very, 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 very big theme. In other words, it wasn't that they were sold the unicorns which the Tories the Conservative Party keep trying to sell each other, that there was somehow a great economic future outside. What a lot of people who voted Brexit were saying, we don't care, really. That's not what animates us. What animates us is an idea of separateness and so on. That's what I found at any rate, and I think that the polls show it up. Now, 4 months after that, the Americans voted for Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not primarily an economics president, despite some of the rhetoric. During the course of the midterms elections, which we've just had, he didn't focus hardly at all upon the economy, which in America is not doing too badly for the moment. Most of what he talked about was the migrant caravan from Guatemala, a relatively small number of migrants making for the southern border, because he thought that was the thing that would motivate his voters most. Stephen Bannon, his erstwhile advisor, who now swans around Europe trying to advise Europeans, said that in the modern election, the thing that sells is anger. Not hope, vide Barack Obama, but resentment and anger. That's the thing that gets people to the polls, these new people to the polls. And so we have a series of actions on the part of Donald Trump which are not primarily economic in motivation. We haven't seen yet whether he'll do the big infrastructural spending, but we have things like the trade war with China or the subsidies given to frankly dying industries in the United States which will not actually save them. Nothing will save the coal industry of West Virginia and so on. Absolutely nothing, not Trump nor anything else. People don't want that stuff, increasingly don't want that stuff. Nevertheless, he will insist on spending on it because the idea is more important than the reality. And it's not just America, and it's not just Britain. Of course, it's happening here in Europe too. In France, though, we have Emmanuel Macron. We've seen the collapse of the main political parties that have existed weaker than in places like Britain because of the system and so on, but nevertheless the collapse of them. We have Marine Le Pen getting through to the second round of the presidential election. We have the resistance to Macron's entirely necessary, it seems to me, you may disagree, reform programme in France. The current resistance to Macron's fuel duties is led by a Bretonne called Jacqueline Moureau, who believes in chemtrails and in ghosts and ectoplasm, and so on. I don't mean to kind of ridicule her, etc., but it's not so long ago since somebody who had those kinds of preoccupations would not have made it as a leader. We have the significant depletion of the two main parties in Germany. And although in the first instance the Alternative für Deutschland seemed to be the major beneficiary, there's also been a significant increase in the position of the Greens. Now, I personally take that to be a positive sign, actually, because of the position that the Greens hold vis-à-vis the major questions in Germany. But there's no doubt that it adds to the idea that the major political parties are in trouble. In Austria, the Freedom Party is once again in power, and I can't tell you, as a person who's half Jewish, with what gloom I look at the kind of descendants of Austrian people like that taking power in a European country. It's upsetting, but at least they could be economically rational. Viktor Orban of Hungary is also now a role model in a country that has suffered actual population decrease. His major theme has been resistance to immigration. There are few countries that need immigration more than Hungary does. Funnily enough. But he's made this the absolute theme. Hungary's economy could be enormously stimulated by a significant degree of inward migration. But no, they set their face against it. We know about the Law and Justice Party in Poland and so on. But I want to concentrate just for a moment, rather than do a great big list, on Italy. Italy, after all, I mean, of course, Italy is no stranger to populism. And I'm not just talking about Mussolini. Berlusconi himself was a kind of anti-establishment populist, believe it or not, back in the day. But nevertheless, one of the most pro-EU countries in the Union. And now has in government the Lega and the Five Star Movement. And the Five Star Movement and the Lega are now kind of vying with each other to see if they can outbid each other because the Lega has been getting more and more popular, Five Star has stayed still, and so on, if you're kind of selling trinkets to the Italian population. So Di Maio, who is the Deputy Prime Minister who represents the Five Star, has said recently, today everyone says that the most important issue is immigration. This is nonsense. All the findings we have tell us the most important issue is work and unemployment. If today we have 6 million poor Italians in Italy, this is causing a social tension that also creates tension with foreigners. This is inevitable. So you might expect that he'd fight the Lega about an anti-immigration policy, but in fact he won't. What he's actually suggesting is that Italy should have a financial and fiscal position, a spending position, which breaks the EU's rules about spending. And not only that, he's saying the Five Star Movement will now become part of an anti-austerity movement in the whole of Europe, which is devoted to the business of borrowing more money and spending more money without the wherewithal to pay it back. Alberto Mingardi of the Istituto Bruno Leone in Milan, who's a much respected commentator, said in Italy today we have beggars' nationalism, the kind that doesn't yearn for other countries' respect, it's happy enough with their money. Even so, despite this thing by the Five Star, the Lega, with its anti-immigration message, is doing better. Well over 30% in the polls. This is a party that could barely collect 9% just of the vote just 5 years ago. And Salvini, its Deputy Prime Minister, is the most popular politician in Italy. And he's a hugely dangerous man, a former communist as it happens. And this is the next thing, the point I want to go on to. The sequence of beliefs that people in leadership now, in America and sometimes in Europe now have, are quite outside our recent experience of the sort of things that leaders would be expected to endorse or to believe in. Now, I wrote a book published a book in 2010 called Voodoo Histories about the history of conspiracy theories and why they were attractive. In 2010, my kind of conclusion was that we had conspiracy theorism on the run, that by and large, by the judicious use of the internet, we would be able to show people that all these arguments about how the Israelis were really behind the 9/11 attacks, etc., why they were so flawed, and we would gradually kind of damp it down. What's happened instead is that conspiracy theorists have gone into government. Because somebody like Salvini, for instance, is a conspiracy theorist. He believes in conspiracy theories. He believes that vaccination, for instance, and mass vaccination, is a trick played upon the Italian people by large pharmaceutical companies, just like the anti-vax movements. One of the most dangerous things in Europe at the moment is the low levels of vaccination for things like measles and so on, which have kept us protected. People actually die because of this stuff. And you have somebody who's the most popular politician in Italy saying that it is something that he actively wishes to see cease, which was compulsory vaccination and so on. The leader of the free world, Donald Trump, came to people's notice as a politician when he endorsed the conspiracy theory that Barack Obama had somehow or other not been born in the United States, but that his birth certificate, his birth, had been faked. Now, to believe this, you have to believe that somehow, back in the day, people knew that Barack Obama was likely to become president and therefore needed to forge his birth statement in the Honolulu newspapers for the day of his birth to say that he had been born there. To have a man as President of the United States, elected President of the United States, who in 2011 was the joke figure of the White House Correspondents' Dinner and Barack Obama because of this crazy belief, is really indicative of where we've got to, because the fact is that his constituency that he was trying to get in the first instance, a significant proportion of Republican voters in the primaries did believe this theory, and it was them he had to impress in the first instance, and he was prepared to do that, and he has never been penalised for it, not by the Republican Party, not by the Republican establishment. So things that Republican congressmen decried just in 2011, birtherism, became the thing that their candidate for president and then their president actually endorsed. And now, when he loses an election, he claims, without any evidence, that there's been voter fraud. And I'll tell you something else, which you probably picked up. A significant proportion of his voters believe that's true. They believe it. Now, this has nothing to do with economic self-interest and so on. It has to do with a malign set of beliefs which are running quite independently of anybody's capacity to catch them. And think about what this means for your world. Now, you've got to think about what it means for your world. It's not really good news for mine, despite the fact this world generates more stories for journalists than we ever would have thought possible, and we've been kept continuously on the go, and it's been very good short-term economic news for me, I can tell you. My world has also been significantly impacted for the worse by what's been going on. I talked about the impunity. Journalists are actually being murdered, have been murdered in Slovakia, have been murdered in Malta, both EU countries, attacked in Hungary and in Poland. The last two independent radio stations in Hungary closed down this week. We know that the United States press has been under significant attack. Essentially, what happens is if the United States press says something that's true, the President of the United States tells everybody it's a lie and that they are liars. We never quite had a situation like that, and a significant proportion of the American people then go on to believe that. Now, you may think, and you may be right, that your world will just adapt and carry on as something like this develops. People, whether they live under Orban or under Trump or under Duterte or whoever, they'll want houses and offices, they'll want their money invested, they'll want pensions. My putative son-in-law, in other words, the guy I hope will be my son-in-law if he ever pops the question, I was discussing, he works in acquisitions in London, and I was putting this to him. He said, you see, the way I look at it really is that the economy will always be primary and it will carry on. People will want these things, we will carry on providing them. Yes, there'll be a few kind of ups and downs, bull markets, bear markets and so on, but nevertheless the fundamentals will always remain the same. But he's much younger than me, and he's not as interested as I am in history. And it's still presumed that by and large rational rulers will do rational things. There'll be a currency fluctuation here, a company failure there, Indian restaurant will go out of business because of these kind of strange decisions, but on the whole everything will carry on. and with the elastic band will snap back to where it was before. A few months ago, I reviewed a book by a guy called David Price Jones in the Wall Street Journal. And David Price Jones was the son of a Viennese banking heiress before the war, of an incredibly, almost incalculably wealthy Viennese banking family. They'd had hunting estates out in Hungary, they'd served in the Austro-Hungarian army, they'd had social connections which were absolutely unparalleled, and so on. But they were Jews. And by 1933, they were out of Germany. By 1941, they were being chased around France and Holland and everywhere else. And by 1944, a substantial proportion of them were dead. Nothing to do with economics. Absolutely nothing to do. In fact, it made no economic sense, but it was all the result of politics. And it was all the result of ideas and anger and resentment and so on. Now, you could say, well, okay, one of the bits of news that we had today, for example, or recent weeks, is that actually the renewables industry has been incredibly successful in replacing coal-fired and high carbon emission sources of energy. And that has all happened despite people's arguments against it. Say in my country, Britain, there was a huge campaign against wind turbines. British people don't like new things on the horizon. We like old things on the horizon. And so we got used to electric pylons, but we didn't like the new wind turbines. That was extremely horrible for us. And yet, and not only that, as soon as we don't like something in Britain, we start a campaign against it, we start finding all the reasons why it can never work. So one of the things that was said about it was that wind turbines wouldn't generate very much power and so on. Actually, I think it's true. I think it's in Scotland now, which is still for the time being a part of the United Kingdom, 97% of our energy can now be generated by renewable energies. And so you could say to yourself, look at our advances, look at the advances in artificial intelligence and so on. And I return to you and I say, things have happened that we haven't anticipated. We didn't anticipate what the world of the internet would lead to. We saw very well some of its huge advantages. Somebody like me loses Google all the time. It's having a library at your fingertip immediately. For somebody who used to work before that was available, is an absolute transformative change for the better. But I didn't anticipate social media being what it was. I didn't anticipate fake news. I didn't anticipate people hiving off into silos of belief in which they were actually unchallengeable and then believing things which were extraordinary and untrue. And I certainly didn't anticipate people acting upon those beliefs. So the thing I'd say about "it's the economy stupid" is that it's absolutely true. It's an absolutely true observation until it isn't. And then, when it isn't, that's when you see the people in uniforms outside your door, or that's when you see the broken windows, or that's where you see the people scrubbing the streets and so on. I'm not saying this is all imminent. I'm saying that we're just heading gently, nicely into the right direction to have these things, unless they are stopped. Unless, if you like, the political reformers and the people with some political vision actually win out. Belshazzar's Feast is one of my favourite Rembrandt paintings. And you remember him, Belshazzar, sitting at the feast, looking up at the wall in which the Hebrew words mene, mene, tekel, upharsin suddenly appear in letters of fire. I am not suggesting that I am your letters of fire on the wall at all. There are many, many other possibilities, and we may very well come out of this. But what I am saying is that I think it's going to be a bumpy ride. Thank you.